Thought Media Network proudly presents a weekly exploration of various spiritual practices with renowned spiritual authors, coaches, teachers, and Dr. Tracy Brown, RScP.
And now, here's Tracy.
Hey everybody, Tracy Brown here, and I am so delighted to welcome you to today's episode of Poetry, Prayer, and Practice. And just in case this is your first time seeing the show, I just want to give you a little bit of a grounding. Why poetry? Why prayer? Why practice? There are a lot of ways you can get in touch with spiritual practice, but what I have learned is that there's so many people who, when you say the term spiritual practice, they think of one or two very specific things. And they often think that you have to do those things and those things only. But what I know and what I believe and what I practice is that there are so many ways to get in touch with and to be grounded through spiritual practice that often go under the radar. And so through some conversations and through an experience I had working with a group of poets over several months, and then we co-published an anthology of poetry together, I thought I really want to keep poetry as a spiritual practice and poetry as a means of connecting us with our spiritual beliefs. I want to keep it up front in my mind. And one way to do that would be to have a weekly show that integrated that on a regular basis. I'm also very connected to prayer, and that there are so many different ways to pray. There are so many different prayer modalities or prayer technologies. And so throughout the year, we get the opportunity to focus on how different people or different spiritual paths pray. And then all the other spiritual practices that maybe we do, but we could do them differently, or we could enhance them, or we could recognize things that others don't realize are spiritual practices. So as a result, every week I get the opportunity to think about, talk about, answer questions about, hear your comments about poetry, prayer, and spiritual practice in whatever form that works for you. Today I am happy and smiling because I do have a featured guest. And this entire month of September 2023, I will have a featured guest each week. We will be talking with Kay Suzanne Massey, who was on the show a couple of months ago. And at least 3 people put in the comments, can she come back? And she said yes to coming back. Laura Hallett on September 19th, and Marie Kirkland at the end of the month, the last Tuesday of the month. But today I get to spend some time with Reverend Dr. Michael McMorrow. And I will say that Reverend Mike is just kind of one of my favorite people in the organization Centers for Spiritual Living. So there is no telling where this conversation will go. Because, when 2 people kind of know each other and they're really comfortable with each other, we don't have a script because I don't believe in scripts. So you really will be eavesdropping on a conversation between friends and colleagues and leaders who are grounded spiritually. I always like to share a few things that I know about the person who is my guest, and then I will do that with Mike, and then I will invite him to share anything else he wants you to know. So one thing that I would tell you about Mike McMorrow is that he is the spiritual leader and senior minister at Granada Hills Center for Spiritual Living in California. The second thing I would tell you about Mike McMorrow is that he is the author of a very cool book titled Blue Collar Spirituality, and the subtitle is Finding a God That Works. Correct me in a minute, Mike, if that's wrong, but Blue Collar Spirituality. And I am going to ask him to talk about that and share some information about that. And the third thing that I'm going to share is that Mike McMorrow is someone who is not just a minister of a single congregation, but he is one of the people that embodies for me the commitment to service as a spiritual practice. And the many, many ways that he has been in service within Centers for Spiritual Living is in itself. We could talk the whole show about how being in service on different committees and in different roles is in fact spiritual practice. So those are my three things that I'm going to highlight, and I'm going to bring Reverend Dr. Mike in and say, hey.
Hello there. It's great to be with you.
So is there anything else you want to share with people that they should know about you to kind of set the stage or set the tone for what we might be talking about?
Well, I suppose my approach to spirituality is very practical, which is one of the things that attracted me to the science of mind philosophy. I had kind of talked my way out of religion, I would say, until I found the writings of Ernest Holmes, which I find to be very poetic. So I love this, the focus of the show of poetry practice and poetry, prayer, and practice, because it was through Holmes that I had always appreciated writing for novelists, but this was the first time that I had actually read someone who said, "Wow, that dude kind of sees things the way I do, but just didn't know how to put words to it." And so, of course, being a minister, you got to prepare messages every week. So you have to become friends with words. And in fact, you become curious, right? Well, where does that word come from, right? And particularly in English, which has this rich and even violent history behind it, because in Europe they were maiming and killing each other for centuries, and English is really kind of a hodgepodge of that as well. So so many of our words have Latin but also French roots in them from that period, and of course the Saxon part being from the Germanic people. So anyway, this is the stuff that I have discovered on my own way, which is kind of funny because, I was a hammer and nails guy, although I was always a very thoughtful person. I liked being outside. I liked working with my hands. I had a skill at visualizing things from 2D to 3D. So as far as reading blueprints and things like that. And so the spiritual practice part was a welcome discovery, even though it was in my 40s. So I'm kind of late to the game, right? Because I'm not 40 anymore. It may look like it with my blurry image here. But anyway, so I'll stop talking now.
So clarify for people who don't know you, you said you were a hammer and nails guy kind of guy. And so
so I worked in the construction industry first as a carpenter and then a contractor for over 30 years. I discovered the science of mind teaching probably about 20 years in or so. I also developed a powerful thirst after working all day. So I had to go to another fellowship to kind of get that situation sorted out. And so this kind of, when I found religious science, I just had always had this thing about, gosh, working people really need to hear about this. And because so many, my experience was that often in my life, I was so busy working that I never really stopped to pay attention to what I was doing, where I was heading. It was just, next thing, next thing, next thing. Not that ministry can't be that way. but if you design it properly, we schedule time to make time. And I want to give you a shout out here. I know you don't like, people blowing orange sunshine in your ear, but what you need to know about Tracy is when you were working I think you were the leadership chair at the time. And is that what your position was?
I have served as the chair of the Leadership Council for
Yes.
CSL.
Okay. So, and I was serving on a committee, and I had scheduled some time because she's a very busy girl, and so I finally, our meeting time came, and I just wanted to jump right into things because I was ready to get going with this meeting, and I didn't want to waste any time. He said, "Okay, wait, let's just stop for a moment, and let's just do a spiritual mind treatment." Because I need to center myself, because you were going from meeting to meeting to meeting, right? Well, this is a great thing for working people to remember, right? Yeah, so we can stop, do a spiritual mind treatment, particularly if there was some stuff that stirred us up from the last meeting, that we can just unload that so that we can be fully present in this moment. And so just to say that you live it, and that's always been an example for me, because I'm the kind of guy, I'll go to the head right away. And that's why I like the poetry focus, right? Because the poetry thing encourages, at least a guy like me, encourages me, oh, there's a whole nother way of doing this thing, whole nother way of seeing it. There's, yes, we can measure, we can quantify, we can qualify, and then still there's this whole nother experience of life that we all long for. But I don't know that we even know that it's a missing component until we do.
Right. So hold on a minute, because I have to now take a breath, because the moment that you said, I'm going to talk about you, I started holding my breath, because I didn't know what kind of story I'm like, okay, that could go this way or this way, and maybe I'll just mute his microphone. but okay, yes, and actually, I'm glad that you shared that example, which I don't remember, right? I don't remember the conversation, and it's a good reminder for me that it does matter. It's not this work that we do, for me, is not performative. Integrating and embodying the spiritual principles and practices into my life, it's not about the performance. It's not about what you should do. And so a lot of times I forget that it has become so integrated into how I navigate my life, the day-to-day in my life, that now I'm kind of going, ooh, that was good. Ooh, good.
Yeah, well, you should. Yeah. I'm with you, because outward displays of piety, right? That's what we used to call it in my old way of thinking.
Yes.
even as a kid, that was a turnoff. Because there's an expression of the sacred or holiness, if you will. People who have it, and they don't need to do the performance art to go with it. Now, as ministers, talking on a Sunday, some of it is performance art for sure. But hopefully it's authentic.
Yes.
And not manipulative. I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of, people need to think this way, so I'll say it this way, and I'll tone it down, and then I'll bring it up, and this whole thing. But people, the truth is people need to be where they are, right?
Yes.
And so our task then is to allow that, and then to say, okay, so here's some tools, right? To bring it back to my old background. Let's get out my toolbox. Let's see what we can, let's see what we can do to unpack some of this. And then maybe we can even heal it. How would that be? How would it be if you didn't kick the ball and drag Charlie around anymore? As Maxwell, I love that quote of his.
Yes,
that happens in working life, but it happens in all of our relationships, really, if we allow it to be so.
Yeah, right? And this is just reminding me of how often I am saying to others, people will say, oh, well, we just, now we need to pray because there's some crisis, or now we need to say our affirmations, and it's kind of like it is true, and it can be true. But when people start talking about that, so that if I do I'm doing this to get a reward or to get recognition, and then that same person, maybe something doesn't go well in their life this week, and they call me and they say, you need to pray, or I'm thinking this happened, like, what am I doing wrong? Right? What am I doing wrong that I didn't get the raise? Or what am I doing wrong that I'm back where I was 3 years ago, and I don't have the money that I thought I would have by now? And it reminds me of people thinking about these spiritual practices as transactional,
right?
And you wanting to use them to escape the realities of human condition, when really, at least I have a bias that I use spiritual practices to help me navigate whatever is going on.
Right.
That they're tools to be used in living life, not tools to be used to escape what is normal human experience or condition.
Right. Yeah, because really all we're doing is putting another patch, a material patch, on some material need. So, and it's natural, we kind of start out in the world in a transactional way, at least in our working world. But even as we learn, we begin to date and so forth, we may even do the transactional thing there. But really what we're looking for is transformation and not transaction. But we don't know that until we know it. So, there's so much confusion around that. Like, I came up in the 70s, and if it feels good, do it, and all of that other stuff. And, it was fine. It was what it was. But really what it did is everybody was just objectifying each other. Right. And so we get into this transactional thing of, well, if you do this part, then I'll do that part. When really what we're looking for is connection, so that we can have a transformative experience of our own life that includes this other person, maybe. Sometimes it doesn't, and that can be painful, right? So we have to learn how to navigate these things. And
Yeah.
to your point also, you know, in other spiritual systems, right, we call it a sin and an offense against God. And so then we say 3 Hail Marys and 4 Our Fathers for world peace, which is great. But we haven't dealt with whatever the driver was of the behavior that was so-called sinful, right?
Yes.
And this is what I appreciated about religious science, is that there's no sin but a mistake, that we are caused to our own effect. And there is this power back of all things that we can both connect with, but also identify as, in this kind of weird, you know, spiritual bellows that's going on, right? Where we kind of step into that realm and then we go back into the world and do whatever it is that we do, right? But you know, just the biblical reference. But then we come to ourselves like the prodigal son, right? Oh yeah, there's another way we can do this. I can treat, I can breathe, I can. You know, what's David White have to say? You know, or even, you know, when you come to see poetry as people, as an expression of that which is ineffable, and trying to describe something that is felt or experienced at a deeper level using metaphor or whatever, to connect with an experience, then, you know, you'll read things like even the Bible then becomes poetry rather than a rule book. And it's so much more powerful and informative as poetry, rather, because now you're talking about ancient people who love the spirit by whatever name they called it, by whatever understanding that they had of it. And in this way, modern peoples then connect with our ancient ancestors to hopefully deepen in our own experience that way, so that then that job I didn't get, you know, the girl left me, you know, whatever thing it is, then there's a kind of spiritual resilience that's built into the package, which doesn't mean, you know, you still don't end up with arrows in your ass, right? But you get, but the pain is less intense and lasts. The duration is much shorter, which that's the great promise of sticking with a program where you are 100% responsible for our own experience, including not blaming ourselves. Right? Well, what in my consciousness created this, right? Right? It's like, who cares, man? What are we going to work with now?
Right. Where do I want to go now?
Right. So I feel like I'm talking too much, so interrupt me at any time.
I know how to interrupt you. I'm just going with you and taking notes like, oh, that phrase, spiritual resilience.
Yeah.
Like, I want to do something with that phrase. Maybe it'll be a poem, but spiritual resilience, that there's something that is there for me to play with.
Yeah, well, you know, Borensenko has an article in Unity magazine where she has a whole thing on resilience. That's probably, I may have even borrowed that from her. But she's right. You know, she was basically saying this is an aspect within our character that we need to reintroduce as a goal or even a practice, right? To practice resiliency, particularly now. You know, the outside world, it seems like everybody's thin-skinned.
Yes.
I thought before it was just me, but now it's everybody.
Yeah, that the resilience to navigate the world we live in, for me, is very much dependent on being spiritually grounded and using the tools that I have available to me so that I don't get so caught up in the world that I lose my vision for what the world can be.
Right.
Right. And so, um, so what that's doing in my mind is going, and that's one of the reasons that you are able to reach and connect with people um, who might have found themselves distancing themselves from spirituality, even if they have aligned themselves with some very strict religious rituals, that they are have distanced themselves from the more symbolic or the more mystery or mystical aspects of spirituality, hence blue collar spirituality.
Yeah.
So talk about the book, because I love the book. I love the process that you went through to create it. I love the book itself. And it does reach people in a different way. So talk a little bit about the book, please.
Well, it's just generally speaking, it's my attempt to reach working people. It's definitely written from a male perspective to men, the who are agnostic. And my premise is that people are a lot more spiritual than they may think they are,
Mm-hmm.
and that the presence of the divine is everywhere around us if we just take a moment to look. And so the beginning of the book is about how to broaden that, which is kind of what Holmes does in the textbook. Only I take 60 pages instead of 600. but, but it's designed to be a fast read because I know who's reading it, right? So it's a blast of just ideas, but the big one, the main one being that there's a power behind everything that we're doing, and if we learn to identify it, we can use it. And so that's in a thumbnail. And then I tell stories about the construction days and my own journey. Of course, it's sort of a memoir, I would say. I get some. My father's Irishness is in there too, and and but it's also, I think, I hope it's an homage to working people. And it's I just really kind of feel like what I hope it does is it gives working people a sense of traction, that they can, yes, because it's not that I didn't like being a carpenter. I liked being a contractor, but I kind of got pushed into the business side of things. Uh, I grew up in the Air Force, so I didn't really have a business background. So I took some knocks in that area. But I did like, and this brings us back to what you were saying, that you learn to serve. And whether you're in ministry, whether you're in a relationship, whether you're in a business, whether you're working for a corporation, learning to serve and to serve for the joy of serving, I think really that's the next leg in our spiritual development, right? That to serve for the joy of serving. Now, that doesn't mean that some days it's like, oh, Jesus, I can't believe I'm still doing this. Right? The chatter doesn't still go on, but we suit up, we show up, and then lo and behold, we're in service and our mood lifts. Why? Because it's no longer about us anymore, right? And it's no longer about what we're being paid. It's no longer about, the other things that we can get snagged on in this human experience, and instead becomes an opportunity to just, if we're lucky, to enjoy the moment and to enjoy our life. Now, I have found that if you focus on those things, then the money, the relationships, the creativity, the sense of freedom, all that kind of handles itself. And I think Holmes says that too, or at least he implies it. If we work on our relationship knowing that we are one with the Spirit and speak our word with authority, and then just move on and do our life, right? Or as a fellow named Chuck C used to say, just do the next indicated thing.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Right. Well, having read Blue Collar Spirituality, I think you do a masterful job of what you said the goal was, like reaching people who need to hear how spirituality is a part of who they already are, whether they know it or not, and what are some of the indicators that make me go, oh, you mean it's not these other, big structure things that I thought it was. It's
Right.
like, oh, and because of your background, the examples very much are relatable, and there are not enough books that target men, and as you said, men who are agnostic. Like there's so much of what is written that is really good, but it requires you to either take a deep dive into intellectual, like it's really very, very mental and kind of elitist, and are written in such a way that, oh, you don't know this? Well, you can't understand what I'm writing until you know this, this, and this.
Right.
And I love that in Blue Collar Spirituality, you just break it down, and the examples are so relatable to everyday people and to blue collar workers.
Well, that's the plan,
Yeah.
It could use a better marketing. And frankly, I kind of need to go through it. I wrote it. I started it before the pandemic, but then I had all this time. I had the rough draft, and I had an editor. So Christian Sorensen told me, because I kept going to these conferences talking about this book I wanted to write. And he said, do yourself a favor, get an editor that you like working with, and, they'll help. And that was the best advice that I had received. And then of course I was finishing it up. And also it was kind of a response to what was going on at the time. So not only did we have all of the Black Lives Matter stuff, not to minimize any of that, but just not to make it a giant talking point. And Floyd, of course, was a tragic thing, but also Dr. Ford before that, and listening to her testimony. And I'm like, I was kind of, I wasn't all that guy, but I could certainly relate to some of what she was talking about. And then I realized, that the religious science philosophy had helped me to kind of deconstruct that guy so that I wasn't that guy anymore. And that happened relatively quickly. So, like in my mid 40s, when you can still, it's not over. There's still life ahead of you. You don't have to be, because, for instance, if you want to attract a good relationship, the hardest question to ask ourselves is, am I the kind of person I'd want to be in relationship with? Right. And so I was like, oh, okay. Oh, we're going to talk about that, huh? Right. So, and again, the teaching is if we take it seriously and we do the work, right? It's not, change your thinking, change your life, and then voila, the new improved me, right?
Right.
We also can't spiritual bypass our way around things, right? So when there was a thing that often happens where in church circles where we start to get into a conflict and people don't like the raised voices and some of the anger that goes with it, but you are kind of getting to the issue, and then someone says call for prayer. So I totally understand it, but the call for prayer should be when everybody has exhausted themselves and has been heard, and we're all sitting there going, well, that's a bunch of bullshit. I don't believe any of it. Where do they get off saying that? I'm not that way. Right? That's the time to do the call for prayer, right? So that we're all like now ready to, okay, so what's got me stirred up, right?
Funny story, because you and I believe the same thing about that. Like that whole scenario, having been in a lot of meetings in a lot of different settings with people who identify themselves as spiritual people who won't actually deal with things from a spiritual perspective. But I hadn't thought about this story in a long time until just now. So I was in a meeting and that was what was happening. And there was someone who said, wait, they just were like interrupting the meeting and asked for a call to prayer. We need to pray. And it was clear what they were wanting prayer about was, people were getting too agitated and there were a couple of voices being raised and they wanted, a call to prayer because we need to get grounded again. And I, before anybody else could volunteer to do the prayer, because there were a couple of people in the room that day who I know were feeling uncomfortable, and they would have prayed that everyone just feels calm and peaceful. And that's nothing wrong with that, except we were right on the verge.
Right.
And so I was like,
needed to be said.
Right. So I was like, let me do the prayer, which of course they did. And what was coming out of my mouth in the treatment of treating for what we want, I was on it with a lot of fire and passion that the wisdom of God, right, is speaking in, as and through every person in the room. And there is emotion and there is passion because there is a desire to move to a new experience, and that requires change, and that requires courage, and the change and the courage that is required is right here in this room with these people. And these are the people who have signed up and right. I just went, I mean, it was probably a 10-minute prayer, and by the time I said all of that, I was very serene at the end of it. And I ended the prayer, and the person leading the meeting, because it was not the meeting I was leading, the person who was leading the meeting, if this is a quote, hot damn, we got some work to do here.
Oh, a demonstration.
And then, it did. The rest of the meeting, it was good. I mean, but it didn't cut off the things that needed to be said. And the people who were feeling uncomfortable became more courageous. And the people who were getting a little agitated actually did come back a little to center. So there was no accusing others. There really was, we are here together because we are leaders who have committed to making a difference.
I
But
think
yeah, that we can't escape it. We can't, or we can pretend, but that's not using our spiritual practices to grow individually or collectively.
so I have the perfect poem.
Bring
I
it.
had this pulled forward in case we got there. It's from Pilgrim by David White. I'm just going
Ooh.
to read a first stanza or two. It's entitled Second Life, but it starts out, my uncourageous life, right? So you were just talking, the treatment gave people the courage to speak up. My uncourageous life doesn't want to go, doesn't want to speak, doesn't want to carry on, wants to make its way through stealth, wants to assume the strange and dubious honor of not being heard. My uncourageous life doesn't want to move, doesn't even want to stir, wants to inhibit a difficult form of stillness, to pull everything into the silence where the throat strains but gives no voice. My uncourageous life wants to stop the whole world and keep it stopped, not only for itself, but for everyone and everything it knows, refusing to stir a single inch until given an exact and final destination. I'm going to stop there because there's a few more pages, but that was perfect that you spoke to that. And I love David White. Susie Shadle,
Yeah.
I heard she just took a new position. And if my information is correct, I think that's brilliant. She brought David White to one of our conferences. I think it was Susie when she was up in Seattle. And I heard that guy and I thought, oh, I think I like poetry. Right? Because I had always thought, by the shores of Gitche Gumee, right? Or Shakespeare, that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
But here's this guy talking about ordinary things and making them extraordinary, which they are, or
Yeah.
maybe pointing to how they really are extraordinary. Yeah.
That is one of the things that I love so much about poetry. And David White is, of course, in the favorite top 10 poets, top 15 poets, because it is that taking or reminding, and for me, reminding me of the miraculous nature of the smallest thing, or the thing that I take for granted, or the thing I never thought about, to slow down enough to see and feel what that's about. And then secondarily, poets like Shalane Harkin, David White, and of course, mystic poets from past generations, to be able to just open the heart.
Right.
Right. So much I can read about in spiritual principle, but it seems so academic. And then the poet takes it and it becomes not a head thing, but a heart thing.
Right. Well, and I'm also thinking of, but his name escapes me now. You might know who he is. He was, I think, in the 60s, a gay black man.
Poet?
A poet, yes. Poet, activist, even, I would say.
In the 60s.
Yeah, 60s, 70s, maybe the 50s.
There are at least 5 names going through my head, so let's not played.
Throw a few out there for our guests.
Well, it depends. What is the point that you're going to make? And then I'll
Well,
probably.
it's just well, he spoke to. So, for instance, he did interviews with the BBC at the time. He did one with the guy who started the National Review, whose name also escapes me. So he wasn't
You're thinking of James Baldwin.
James Baldwin. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just talk a little bit more, and I bet I will know. Yeah, James Baldwin was a novelist who gets quoted a lot because his prose is like poetry.
Yeah. See, you learn something new every day.
Mm-hmm.
But he spoke to the struggle, right?
Yes.
This, and the struggle that if we allow ourselves to open our hearts, a struggle that we can all relate to in some way. But his in a like, for instance, I did not know that he was living as a gay man, for instance, which in fact, I didn't know really any of these writers until they came up in the global themes. As much as I sometimes rag on having to try and structure things around those themes, they do push me and they do direct me to new writers, to new ways of thinking, and keep fresh before me the moments of my high resolve. Right.
Howard Thurman. So for people who are not CSL affiliated, in Centers for Spiritual Living, there is a group each year that creates a global theme for every month and talk titles for every week throughout the year that any CSL affiliated member community can use in terms of organizing themes throughout the year. So there are a lot of communities that are talking about the same theme, the same topic at the same time. And one of the things from a stained glass spirit perspective and in diversity and inclusion perspective, one of the things that I find myself talking to people a lot about is, yes, look at the quotes you use, the stories you tell, the music you choose, and the books that you refer to. Mm-hmm. And if you notice that, there are people who are just like me by race or gender or age group or culture. And that's one of the easiest things that we each can do, all of us can do, is really look for new poets, new authors, new or different musicians than just the music I grew up listening to.
Right.
So it not only helps from reaching different people, but it grows us individually as well.
Yeah. Well, and just to let you know, I just finished up with a group of practitioners. And I'm like, oh gosh, more of this DEI stuff, right? We have to go back. I know. Shame on me. God, do we really have to go into this again? How many times do I have to keep rehashing this material, right? So we get into the newly included chapter in the practitioner training, and my new students were on fire, and they just kept going on about stained glass spirit and how it really fired them up. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll just keep stoking it then. And so, and the thing about that is when you go into practitioner training or even ministerial, but particularly practitioner training, people kind of struggle to find their voice or what is that place of interest that uniquely speaks to me. And that was what came of that particular chapter, where two of the students really connected.
Wow.
With that chapter, with that book. And, and it was a good reminder for me, the old white guy, Right? To go, oh yeah, okay, we still have work to do here. So just telling
So
on myself.
so you can do that. Yeah, you know me, the old white guy. But because you can say that to me, and I know the fullness of the work that you've done and the approach that you've taken and what you've done in your own expansion, so that it is at the point where some of it is just so built in, it does seem awkward to focus on it because you've integrated so much.
Sure.
But for people who don't know that about you and are like, did he really say that to Tracy? Like, me, I'm just a white guy. Like, it's like what they don't know is, oh, am I going to even be able to recall what was the talk that you did at Asilomar?
Spirituality and the recovering redneck.
Yes, it was like recovering something. What was it? But
Right.
yeah, the recovering redneck. That was so I still like refer people to how well you owned what culture says, what society says, and owned the individual person's responsibility to be guided by spiritual truth, not societal truth,
Right.
and to be an example of unity and harmony and
Well,
wholeness.
and and also, if we really want to change what's going on out there, then I think it's important that guys who look like me speak up and uh, as uh, as an ally who, uh, like I said in my talk, I didn't really grow up with the race stuff because I grew up in the Air Force. But you still have some of it, right? Uh, but I had to do a lot of work with the LGBTQ stuff, and and that didn't happen until I came to religious science. I knew some of the stuff. I wasn't. It's not like I was militant or anything like that. But this is the great promise for this particular teaching. As we learn to as we learn to understand that there's a power back of all things and work from there, then the rest, like I said, the rest of it kind of, our hearts get open, really is what it is. I remember I have one of my friends here became one of my friends from my very first class. He was a gay fellow, was in relationship, and and so I'm listening to him one day and I'm realizing, wow, these two guys have been together longer than two of my marriages. Right. And I'm like, so what's going on here? And so they kind of led by example. But I think it's like a lot of things, when you know people and you take the time to get to know them, and even maybe at least hold them in high regard, maybe even love them, right? Then you realize, okay, you know, I need to look at this and to understand that really at the end of the day, it really is all about love. And out of that love, loving kindness, compassion, respect, right? Honoring, and particularly now when we have people who may have vastly different opinions on how the world works than we do, and that's where our work is. It's not with the folks who already agree with us, right? And that's what your book is saying too. At least that's what I got out of it, is that that's where the work is. If we really want to change, be the change we want to see in the world, we have to hang out with in the places where we're not as comfortable sometimes.
Sometimes we do. It is all part of it.
Right.
And if we truly are using and relying on poetry, prayer, and practice,
Yeah.
then we can navigate any of that, all of that. Like there are no sides in the circle of God, right?
Right.
It's a circle. So I want to dance it through the circle, which means everybody's not like me.
Right.
So our time is winding down. We have like 3 minutes. I'm never surprised that that happens, but it's very inconvenient because we still have so much to talk about.
Right.
Um, so I don't know. You want to end with the poem that opens your book? Or do you want to end with telling people how they can learn more about you? What do you want to talk about for 2 minutes?
Well, first of all, I'm glad I said yes to this. It's been nice to have you all to myself for a period of time. And just because it's easy, I will read this. So, this is out of my book, Blue Collar Spirituality Finding a God That Works. And by the way, I'm impressed that you remembered the subtitle. And you can find it on Amazon. And it's entitled this. It's for anyone who works outside. And since Labor Day was just yesterday, and this is the inspiration of this was David White, who we spoke to. And this is up in his end of the country, too. One cold January morning on Discovery Bay, frigid and icy, geese honking. Stuck to the frozen pond, I consider revenge for yesterday's violation by the gander of 5. With drizzle softly falling, we scrape the ice from the concrete slab, preparing for the chalk-lined snap, laying out a room for a life yet to be realized. The winds blow now, driving the drizzle turned sleet down the back of my till now warm woolen neck, and still we scrape and snap, clearing the deck of yesterday's scrap and waste, making way for new walls waiting to be nailed together, stood in place, plumbed, lined, and true. And now, with the north wind bearing down harder still, we surrender to the now sideways driven rain. We pick up our rain-soaked tools, roll up our cords, and take shelter in the truck, our revenge of warmth thawing our soaked-through jeans. Reaching under the seat, we take a long pull on the flask saved just for this moment. Cursing in our clothes, steam rising now, sodden with the tempest just unleashed upon us. We start the truck, heading for home, turning from the gravel path onto St. George Road into the brilliant sunshine behind the storm, and we realize we've just weathered a cold front passing through. We look at each other, beads of thawed water trickling off the end of our nose, and I think to myself, next winter, California.
I love that. I smiled the first time I read it, and then to hear you read it, it's like, yes, next
Yeah.
week, California. So our time is completely up. I'm so glad that you said yes, and we'll have to do this again sometime in the future. And everybody, this is Mike McMorrow, and I hope that you've enjoyed this show today as well. If you want more of poetry, prayer, and practice, all you have to do is tune in every Tuesday at noon Mountain Time. Got some very great guests coming up in the next few weeks, and so please follow up and or mark your calendar now if you want to be sure not to miss Kay Suzanne, Laura, or Marie. That's all we have time for today. My name is Tracy Brown. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.
Thanks for watching. Join us again next week. Or watch on demand at www.ntmedia.org or youtube.com/New Thought Media Network. New Thought Media Network, positively inspiring. Learn more at www.ntmedia.org.